Guillaume Connesson is one of today's leading composers. Born in France in 1970, his music is frequently performed by orchestras across the world. He's one of a fairly small group of European modernists whose music is played in the United States, perhaps because, despite its complexity, his idiom is understandable and graspable by the general public, as all the best music should be. Rooted in his national French tradition, his music is born out of love for Debussy and Ravel, Messiaen and Stravinsky, but with a highly individual and attractive originality. It's musician's music. One can tell he knows the whole canon and wants to be a part of it, and he writes brilliantly for orchestra. Flammenschrift, or flame writing, is the perfect companion for Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. The composer writes about the piece, "I wanted to compose a work with a fierceness that would draw a psychological portrait of Beethoven, and more generally, pay homage to the music of Germany. My portrait of Beethoven is that of a man of great anger, seething and impetuous, whose inner violence transpires in numerous works of music." Flame writing has numerous allusions to his works. The music erupts with an enormous energy that doesn't let up for its entire 9 minutes. And there's a deliberate forcefulness in the style of writing, which I'm sure comes from an understanding of how Beethoven composed. The great composer often wrote down a musical idea in a notebook, before repeatedly revising it, beating it into submission, until it existed in its most memorable, potent version. Think of how many famous Beethoven works have small musical ideas, let's say earworms, like that at the start of the Fifth Symphony, that are repeated and developed in hundreds of ways. It's this determination to compose the ideal that flame writing's title refers to. Of particular note is one passage that seems to refer directly to the finale of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. As we'll see in just a moment, Beethoven's movement works by repeating a simple, highly rhythmical melody, but moving it through different keys. Connesson does exactly the same thing, with a melody that sounds akin to Beethoven's, even putting it in the cellos and basses, just as Beethoven does. Two things I particularly admire in this piece are its harmony and its counterpoint. Connesson's harmony is crystal clear, even when it's new and unusual. It's full of suggestive colours that conjure up 1,000 images. Unfortunately, many of today's composers don't write good harmony. Second, he writes independent melodic lines for all the instruments in the orchestra, what musicians call counterpoint, rather than simply giving the different musicians the different notes of a chord. Ask any viola player how often they just play long notes in a new piece. In this way, his music is firmly part of the classical tradition, but bringing it into today's world. Exactly what I believe new music should be. I think you're going to really like this piece. So, on to Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. One of his most popular and frequently played, each of the 4 movements is characterized by a particular dance rhythm. Wagner called the symphony the apotheosis of the dance, and it's hard to imagine a better description. The first movement begins with a slow, profound introduction. The very first chord always reminds me of the sensation of jumping into a cold swimming pool, a bracing shock, but then a feeling of joy. The main allegro theme makes use of a rhythm that sounds like saying the word Amsterdam over and over again. Bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum. The haunting second movement is perhaps the symphony's most famous, used in many commercial settings today, most recently as the background music for a scene in the movie The King's Speech, featuring Colin Firth. It's an allegretto. The work doesn't have a slow movement, which has a solemnly welling beauty intensified by counterpoint. It had to be encored at the premiere and was so popular in the 19th century that it was often substituted into other Beethoven symphonies, which drove the composer crazy. The scherzo is incredibly fast, alternating with a bucolic, slower trio. For the first time, Beethoven experiments with alternating between the scherzo and the trio more than once, an experiment that would really pay off in the Ninth Symphony. The finale is frenetic, unrelenting, and incredibly exciting. It's this searing, repetitive, unstoppable energy that Connesson captures in flame writing. Again, one rhythmic cell is repeated even more ruthlessly than in the other movements, creating a kind of wild joy that propels the symphony to its powerful close. Continuing the theme of dances, the concert ends with one of the great orchestral masterpieces of the mid-20th century, Rachmaninoff's magnum opus, Symphonic Dances. Written in 1940, when Rachmaninoff was living on Long Island, New York, it's the composer's final work. It's in 3 movements that Rachmaninoff originally entitled Noon, Twilight, and Midnight. The first dance depicts the blazing heat of the noontime sun. Its main theme is based on a simple descending arpeggio in the woodwinds, answered by thunderous strokes of chords in the whole orchestra. A middle section full of yearning follows, featuring the austere sound of the alto saxophone, a visitor in the symphony orchestra. The second movement depicts twilight, perhaps the most seductive time of day. It's announced by a rather tired brass fanfare, before beginning a wild waltz. As we know from Ravel's La Valse, the waltz is often seen as a symbol of old Europe, of the world before the First World War and the Russian Revolution. Rachmaninoff had been in exile since 1918, never again setting foot in his homeland. There's a sense of loss, of nostalgia for what cannot be recovered, as the violins and cellos begin a glamorous theme, but with something sinister behind it. The music reaches a great swirling climax as if it's drunk on its own excess. It's almost like we're looking at an overripe fruit that's just about to start to decay. Soon there will be only ghosts left dancing in the ballroom. The third movement signals the arrival of midnight, with 12 strokes of the clock in the bells and flute. The wild rhythm of a bacchanal begins in the strings, bringing to mind the Witches' Sabbath of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. We're introduced to a martial theme in the side drum, very Russian and different from the bacchanal. Then after a long nostalgic middle section, the opening dance rhythm returns, with the addition of one of Rachmaninoff's obsessions, the Dies Irae plain chant. In the church, this chant describes the day of wrath, day of judgment, when the world will be turned to ashes and mankind will be judged. Rachmaninoff grew up in the Russian Orthodox Church and knew its symbolism well. This ominous theme occurs in his Second Symphony, the Third Piano Concerto, and the variations on the theme of Paganini, and now it returns in the composer's farewell work. This introduces a spiritual quality that grows stronger as the finale continues. Suddenly, the music stops, and the martial rhythm returns in the cellos and violas. Decadence has its price, and Judgment Day has come. But now something miraculous happens. The austere, foreboding plain chant is turned into something dancing, full of joy and life, as if Rachmaninoff has finally thrown away his fear of the Dies Irae and is celebrating the will to live. And as if to make the point explicit, he writes Alleluia in the score, above a joyful melody for trumpets and xylophone. From here, the piece worked itself up to a tremendously rousing finish. But the lasting impression is not that of excitement, but of the powerful spiritual transformation we sense in Rachmaninoff, banishing the demons of his past and accepting and celebrating his humanity, right at the end of his life, in exile, far away from home. For these concerts, we welcome the great American conductor Michael Stern, longtime music director of the Kansas City Symphony. I'm really looking forward to joining you in the audience at these concerts.